Thank you very much, Lena, and good morning to everyone. I will be presenting on human trafficking and drug trade, which happens to be a foremost non-traditional security threat in Sri Lanka. So this actually, so as we know, human trafficking and drug trade has been an issue over time, but in recent times it has become a topic of discourse, so I'll be talking about it. So starting off, let's look at a little brief introduction as to how human trafficking started. Human trafficking basically dates back to the age of old transnational crime. And this during the rampant Greco period has happened to be one of the most crucial times of human trafficking. So for examples, during the rampant Greco times, slaves were considered property under the Roman law and had no legal form of parenthood. Also, most slaves would never be freed at the time. And unlike Roman citizens, they would be subjected to corporal acts of punishment, sexual exploitation, and other modes of torture. And then we enter into the new phase of human trafficking history, which is colonialism. So we could talk about the New World, actually, the African slave trade action with the New World. Now, this also was regarded as to be one of the most crucial times of human trafficking. Most of the slaves that were transported from Africa came from Central Africa and West Africa. Slaves at the time were denied the rights to marry freely, and masters did not even accept them as part of family members. Worse, the New World slaves were considered to be the property of their owners. And slaves were convicted of revolt of murder, which was completely brutal at the time. And that's where you could also see racism also triggered from what we have been experiencing right now. And then we come to the trafficking of indentured laborers between the colonial territories, which is South Indians to Sri Lanka during the colonial rule. Now, this happened during the crisis of the 16th century. So this started when the first Sri Lankan colonial acts, the Portuguese came and invaded to Sri Lanka and then started colonizing the country. And that's when they decided to get down Indians from South India in order to get the work from the plantations done in Sri Lanka. So there we could also see an experience of human trafficking being experienced in Sri Lanka. And then we could talk about as to how this has closely linked with its drug trade, which is the opinion trade between British India and China. The states were the driving forces. All these ventures were direct state-sponsored projects. However, now back in the colonial times and even the rampant Greco times, though human trafficking was a major problem and this had happened on a very obvious sort of basis, it was never addressed as an issue, as in there was no authority or control over it. However, the context of this changed after 1945, as it openly became an international crime, as in people acknowledged this to be an international crime. Also, I would like to say that during the Cold War, and human trafficking was not a prominent issue as such. However, because the borders between the two ideological camps tight close were hardly any significant for people between them. However, migration was considered to be an issue as there were illegal forms of migration going on. So this could be considered to be actually a form of human trafficking. So as it says, it was continued as an unweighted but in different form, and it was also organized in crime networks which were taken as the lead. And it is also plausible and probable that transnational occurred elsewhere throughout the world, but it did not socialize the formation of focus. Human trafficking in the initial post-Cold War was mainly viewed in the context of illegal migration, which also falls within the borders of category of transnational organizational justice. And thus, that's where we experience sex trafficking, forced labor, and debt bondage. Sex trafficking could be identified as the process of individuals being trafficked and exploited sexually. Forced labor is also could be identified as a process where individuals are being misled and then transported to countries and then forced into modes of labor, and debt bondage is actually the pledge of the person's service of security for the repayment for a debt other than obligation, where the terms of repayment are not clearly reasonable stated, and the person who is holding the debt that has some part of our labor. So my objectives for the presentation are to find out our true proportions of the problem, why Sri Lanka has become a center of transnational crime during recent times, how the Sri Lanka government has addressed the issues, and to what extent is this successful and why is it not successful. Before we move on to those questions, I would like to define the UN definitions of it. Yeah, and it's so the UN defines human trafficking as the harboring or receipt of fears of force, of other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or a position of vulnerability, of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. That's how the UN defines human trafficking. And then for drug trade, it could be defined as a global illicit trade involving the cultivation, manufacture, distribution, and sale of substances which are subjected to drug prohibition of laws. This is defined by the United Nations Office of Drugs and National Crime. Yes, and moving on, I would like to talk about how how drug and human trafficking has been the aspect of Sri Lanka's context. Sri Lanka has been considered as an origin of transit and destination country for human trafficking. So along with human trafficking, drug trade is considered to be one of the main problems in Sri Lanka. According to the Justice Minister Ali Sabri, he stated that 553,000 people, about 2.5% of the population, are addicted to means of drugs, and there are 40% of people in the country that are actual drug addicts. Drug related court cases have gone up to 6,600 cases in 2015 to 16,000 cases in 2019. In May 2020, police narcotics unit seized 225 kilograms of heroin on May 15 from a house of Valisara, North Colombo. This is not an isolated incident. So as you can see, this has been a rampant issue over time, and this is something that the Sri Lankan government is actually struggling in order to combat through. Also, I would like to indicate that there are 3 types of human trafficking in Sri Lanka. For example, the first one is tricking Sri Lankan women and transporting them to Middle Eastern and Europe for forced labor. This is something that not only it has been experienced during recent times, but it has been the subject of talk for a long time. And then there is the trafficking of girls from other countries to Sri Lanka for commercial sex. And then you get trafficking of people, uh, Sri Lankan and other nationals, on a hazardous event to other destinations. This is mainly where people are being misled into being told that they are being transported to countries for better, for like better achievements or like better opportunities. However, they are being misled and transported to other countries. But not all, but some undocumented migration corporation epitomize the sophisticated end of criminal operations. And in March 2021, Sri Lanka Navy has detected 24 illegal migrations in the Kuliapita while they were preparing to board fishing vessels in an attempt to illegally migrate to Canada. I would also like to highlight as to how Sri Lanka happens to be a main hub for drug trafficking and human trafficking. Because as you all know, Sri Lanka is a place at the epicenter of the Indian Ocean. And it also happens to be an island, which makes it convenient for other countries to transport their human trafficking acts and drug dealing acts to the center of the country, which in turn generates serious episodes of crime, which happens to be a major problem in Sri Lanka. Now, as I mentioned before, this map shows you as to how Sri Lanka happens to be one of the main hubs and how other countries take it for granted in order to conduct their human trafficking activities, and drug trade activities. Also, when talking about the implications, as mentioned before, the phenomenal increase in busting human trafficking attempts and unremitting discovery of large haul of drugs point to the fact that Sri Lanka has become a transshipment hub for human trafficking and drug trade in the Indian Ocean. As I mentioned before, Sri Lanka has become a transshipment hub for human trafficking and drug trade in the Indian Ocean, which we can see that we are actually experiencing large episodes of problems right now. The strategic location of this country is the prime cause of this situation. And as crime networks behind these clandestine operations are interlinked, the threats are often interlinked. So that's why you can see as to how drug trade and human trafficking is interlinked in Sri Lanka. However, we did experience, actually during recent COVID times, we did experience decreased amounts of human trafficking being shipped to Sri Lanka, but we did experience uprising amounts of drug trade being conducted to Sri Lanka, and how the issue has been addressed. So in the post-war context, they have become the top priority by the present president and as well as the former president. Yes, in recent times, the former president and present president have taken strict measures in control in addressing this issue. For example, the Sri Lanka Policy Framework, the National Policy of Drug Abuse of 2005, was the amendment, actually the framework was amended in 2016. So which leading to Sri Lanka has two main criminal laws relating to trafficking: the Convention on Preventing and Combating Trafficking in Women and Children for Prostitution, and the Penal Code, the Amendment Act of number 16 of 2006. The central government agency, the National Dangerous Drugs Control Board, NDDCB, established in 1984 with wide-ranging powers, coordinate the activities of relevant agencies, craft treatment, rehabilitation, and education programs, and coordinate with regional and international organizations involving in drug control activities. So you can see these are some of the frameworks that have been improved over the years and even implemented during recent times. However, the argument also lies, for my argument, though Sri Lanka government is taking extreme measures in combating this problem, it also is struggling hard to address these twin threats as it comes together. But its success is hampered due to institutional and statutory shortcomings of corruption. Also, would like to mention, as I mentioned, though Sri Lankan, the government and police narcotics, they're taking immense measures in order to combat this problem, the corruption also lies. So for example, the involvement of some police officers from police narcotic bureaus have been reported to have stored drugs in safe houses and carried out like rampant raids and siphon off portion of the seizures to sell drug dealers and to pocket millions in profits. Also, the legal framework to counter human trafficking in its broadest sense of term needs to be improved continuously. Also, there are many government agencies and law enforcement tools dealing with this organized crime. They often work without proper coordination with each other. So these are the these are the hindrances causing this from being addressed more widely, this issue. And with regard to the actions against criminal labor, recruiters under the Bureau of Foreign Employment Act, the report stated that in 2008, the Sri Lankan Bureau of Foreign Employment initiated 400 raids on fraudulent labor recruitment agencies and took legal actions against 80 agencies, resulting in 32 license cancellations and the impositions of fines. I would like to conclude my presentation by saying that though this drug trade and human trafficking has been an identified transnational crime and it has been addressed continuously, the government is still not in a place to address its whole issue. So like it says, there is limit to what could be done nationally, and Sri Lanka is confronting only the tip of the iceberg. And this is due to the limited availability of resources and assistance that we need right now. So coordinated regional approach is heavily needed right now. And also, these challenges constitute to a key strategic concern in the Indian Ocean for some time to come. A collective approach that combines national, regional, and global involvement and collaboration is the need of the day right now. So with that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you very much.